Happy final pay-per-view ever, degenerates, degeneritas, and degenerati. Welcome back to the MMA RAXPOD for UFC 323, Dvalishvili versus Yan 2, coming to you live from Las Vegas on Saturday, December 6th. Please like, share this video, and subscribe to the YouTube channel and follow on X at MMA Rax. If you have not already, thank you for tuning in once again and for your continued support. We did break over 100 viewers on the last RAXPOD, which I'm very grateful for after I said that we needed to bounce back. However, based on the previous highs that we reached earlier in the middle of this year, I know that we can do better, but I can't do it without your support. So thank you once again for continuing to do so. And yeah, I look forward to giving you some betting insight on 14 fights, which I think is a new personal high for the RAXPOD. Usually I'm targeting around 8, 9, or 10 with some stayaways. There's only, excuse me, one fight that I'm staying away from on this card, I believe. Otherwise, I think I've got about 13 picks. And there's interesting fights up and down this card. I don't know how much casual appeal there is relative to the last pay-per-view, but I do think if you're a hardcore fan that there is certainly stuff of interest up and down this card from the very beginning on early prelims. So certainly going out with a bang, as the UFC typically does at the end of the year, going to be very exciting. Of course, the meme of the RAXPOD is I always say I'm going to try to breeze through these, and then I end up going for several hours at a time. That being said, I did go pretty fast for 13 fights on the last pay-per-view, so I am going to be trying to match that pace, at least for this one, given I have so much to get through on this. I am going to be trying to keep it around 5 minutes for each of these, and we'll see how quickly we get out of here. I've got some more extended thoughts for some of these fights that I took a little bit more of my time with. But overall, I am going to try to get through this as quickly as possible while still making it a enjoyable listening experience for you. Busy time of year for me, all things considered. I did a live stream last weekend that within the first 24 hours got about 20,000 views across social media for my other gig. And yeah, it's a very busy time in the sports betting world with the Missouri launch. So I'm coming to you Wednesday morning. Going to try to get this done as quickly as I can so I can get on to all the other stuff I have to do and have this ready to go Wednesday evening. But I appreciate your support. Thank you very much. And yeah, I won't beat around the bush much further than that. Let's get into it. I am 15 of 19 on my last 2 cards worth of picks, and granted, most of that has been chalk, but I do have a couple, or more than a couple, underdog spots on this card. Wanted to make it 4, but I got a little bit tripped up with a fight that we'll get into much further into the show. That being said, without further ado, let's start breaking down these fights, the main reason you're all here, and we will start with the opening early prelim, which is Mairon Santos and Muhammad Naimov. Santos enters 17-1, last fought at Fight Night Burns Morales earlier this year in May, where he secured a unanimous decision over Sadiq Yusuf. Prior to that, got one of the more controversial, arguably most controversial decision of the year in a fight that I picked him to lose and that many people judged him to have lost against Francis Marshall at UFC 313. Prior to that, he won the Ultimate Fighter by knocking out Khan Offley in the second round. A common opponent that he has with his current opponent, Muhammad Naimov, who enters 13-3, last appeared at Fight Night Hill Roundtree Jr. in Azerbaijan in June, where he earned a unanimous decision win over Bogdan Grad. I believe at least one of the judges scored that 29-28. I did pick Grad as an underdog to win that one, and it was judged to be a 29-20. I believe Grad won the first round, and then Naimov came back and won the next 2 rounds. So all things considered, I've been pretty critical of Naimov's cardio and ability to win decisions throughout his UFC run. But to his credit, he's now 3-0 by decisions during his time in the UFC. Granted, some people would argue he lost his decision, or the last round at least of his decision win over Nathaniel Wood, where he was a substantial underdog. But he did outright take his decisions over Khan Offley and Bogdan Grad. Of course, Grodd, I believe, is now 0-2, or has lost his last 2 fights at least after losing to Luke Riley at the fight night last weekend. In addition to that, Con Offley has not had a great run himself, although he did get a win over Ricardo Ramos, granted one in which he blatantly cheated by grabbing the fence to get out of a submission attempt that he might not have otherwise been able to deal with, and was not penalized as such. That being said, he did get I believe it was a 30-27 unanimous decision over Con Offley. This is a very interesting fight to open. I think this is a good benchmark for really assessing where Santos is at, because he is only 25 years old, training at one of the best camps around at Extreme Couture. This card is actually opening with 3 straight fighters from Extreme Couture on it, funny enough. But this is an interesting step up of sorts for Santos. You could have, to the casual observer, you would have said Sadiq Yusuff is a step up, but obviously we know that he's certainly fallen from grace in his career in recent years. So it's not, even though that is a name that looks nice on paper, we know he wasn't fighting, the prime Sadiq Yusuff that went into his main event against Edson Barboza as the favorite, nearly won that fight by finish, and then ultimately kind of just chased the finish, didn't get it, and then slowly deteriorated over the last 4 rounds to lose a unanimous decision to Barboza, who himself is fighting a bit further up this card. That being said, Santos has a sweep on the striking stats here, so even though Naimov isn't a bad striker in his own right, and I've heard from various people over the course of this week that he does have some sort of good Taekwondo background, the raw striking stats that he's had in the UFC have not been very good. Negative striking differential, below average significant strike accuracy, and far below average striking defense, compared to Santos, who not only has been pretty average in terms of his own striking pace, but lands very, very, very heavily in just about every single strike that he has, whether it's punches or kicks, and has proven to be pretty defensively responsible, all things considered. Where Naimov could have some success in this fight is with the wrestling. If you go back and you watch the semifinal fight that Santos had on The Ultimate Fighter, it was a little bit surprising to see that Santos got the decision that he did, given he was controlled for, I believe, a good amount of that fight. I was surprised to see him get the nod, but he has continued to look better since then, and he certainly looked better than he did in the Francis Marshall fight. And Francis Marshall is somebody who I have a very high opinion of, having backed him in several of his fights, including the one that he arguably won against Santos. But the general trend with fighters at this age that are at really good camps is they continue to make very, very good improvements very quickly. That's another thing I'm going to invoke further up on this card with another fighter that I believe is the same age as Santos, or within a year, give or take. That being said, for as long as this fight stays on the feet, I expect Santos to have more success. If Naimov is able to bring this to the ground, it's possible that Santos could have some trouble getting back up, and Santos has shown somewhat below average takedown defense himself. But Santos also has slightly more experience, not slightly, but a couple more fights of experience going the distance in his own MMA career. But he's proven to be much more consistent in those fights that do go the distance than Naimov has in his, despite the fact that Naimov does have those recent unanimous decision wins under his belt, granted against probably lower competition than I think what he's going to get against Santos here. But I think the overall, I think this is a good benchmark fight in terms of assessing where Santos is at and what his ceiling is going to be and how much further he has to improve. I think he's got a very bright future in the UFC, given his age and the fact that he's training at Extreme Couture, and I've heard he spent some time at Fighting Nerds as well since his last fight. So regardless of which camp he spent more time at, those are obviously 2 very high-level camps, I think better than the ones that wherever Naimov is getting his. So even if Naimov is able to bring this fight to the ground, I don't necessarily think, based on his long-term performance, that he has the cardio to support 15 minutes of a control-based decision. And if this fight is close, we have seen Santos in fights that take place in Las Vegas, as the one at UFC 313 against Marshall did, get graceful judging, in my estimation, largely because he's a recent Ultimate Fighter winner and they want to prop up the winners of those shows as much as they can. They seem to have already cut bait with Ryan Loder based on what happened last weekend. That being said, I think that they're much more optimistic about where Santos at given his age and the fact that he's won both of his fights since coming off of that Ultimate Fighter win. So I'm going to say Santos wins a 29-28 decision here where he gives up one round to Naimov, largely based on control. That'll probably be in the first two. I think this will be 1-1 going into round 3, and then I see Santos making the adjustments he needs to keep the fight standing and landing the more effective strikes while staying out of danger and not taking any shots that might otherwise swing the round. And I see him getting a 29-28 decision here over Muhammad Naimov. So give me Marion Santos to win 29-28. The next fight is Mansur Abdul-Malik and Antonio Trócoli. Abdul-Malik is 8-0-1, last fought at Fight Night Usman versus Buckley. That was in Atlanta in June, where he, at the time, earned a technical decision win over Cody Brundage. However, the rules in the the Georgia Commission for MMA state that you are not allowed to score incomplete rounds, which is a unique stipulation relative to what the more traditional rule set is. So at the time, he was given the technical decision win. It was ultimately overturned because Brundage's camp appealed the result on the basis of that stipulation and were correctly rewarded a draw because Abdul-Malik split the opening 2 rounds with Cody Brundage. So fair play to Brundage there. And just a continuation for Brundage of what has been an unbelievably bizarre UFC career. Conversely, Trócoli last appeared over a year ago at this point at Fight Night Magny versus Pratis, where he lost by first-round guillotine submission to Tresean Gore. I believe I picked Trócoli as an underdog in that fight, still having some... I can't remember if I took the... I can't remember if it was an... I got my pick wrong for whatever it was, but I picked against Gore, it just wasn't the right move at the time, and Trócoli seems to have moved on to his taking his poker player career more seriously than MMA at this point. I've heard conflicting reports about whether he's still actually with Mackenzie Dern or not this week. I heard that they broke up, but I've also heard that they're still together. I've heard in fact that they're married. I don't know what the case is, but the point is, I don't know how much past or present relationships with a UFC champion UFC champion are going to help Trócoli here. I don't really have much to say about this fight. Most obviously, I mean, Malik is like what, a minus 1,200 favorite, opened minus 1,000, which is just absolutely comical. I think possibly opened even, I think he opened at 800 actually, but the line might have been taken down and reposted again because now I'm seeing that it was actually minus 1,000 he opened it. Any fight where the favorite is opening in minus 1,000 is a joke matchup. It shouldn't be happening. Abdul-Malik has consistent, but the reason you should avoid the under here is because the UFC, for whatever reason, has continually given Abdul-Malik predatory matchmaking. Dusko Todorovic was obviously someone they expected him to take advantage of, and that's still his best UFC win, and he did do that inside 1.5 rounds. On that basis, I felt very comfortable taking the under in his fight against Nick Klein, where he was another massive favorite. And he not only played around with his food and was too tentative in that one, but actually ended up, I think, losing the first round in most people's estimation because he suffered kind of a Hail Mary head kick at the hands of Nick Klein before ultimately being able to turn around in the second round and got the knockout a minute after the 1.5 round, the under 1.5 would have cashed, which was brutal for me because I believe I made it a parlay leg on that card, UFC Seattle. So I advocated at UFC Atlanta, you should probably just stay away from this one. And that ended up being the right call because, again, Abdul-Malik, I believe, I heard earlier this week on another show that he expressed that he wanted to show his 3-round cardio in that fight for whatever reason, instead of trying to finish Brundage, who has shown a capacity for getting put away early and by better fighters, and that didn't end up manifesting. And he not only didn't end up getting a win, but it ended up taking away his record of pure wins as a result because of the appeal from Brundage's camp. So, yeah, Abdul-Malik should totally steamroll here. Like, round 1 KO is probably what I think the most likely outcome is. But this guy has a history over his most recent fights of not taking care of business right away. And Trócoli is a guy that, as unimpressive as he's looked, was still able to survive into fights against presumably more talented strikers, such as that of Shara Bullet, where he was able to go all the way into nearly the plus 2.5 rounds, nearly cashed in that fight. It was 3 seconds short of 2.5 minutes in the final round, in a fight that I believe took place in Saudi Arabia a year and a half ago. So you got to stay away here. I don't think Trócoli has a chance, but the question is he going to show the same kind of survival skills and interest in making it deeper into the fight that he did against Shara Bullet, or is he just coming in here for a payday that he can throw into his poker purse and get out of T-Mobile and back to the poker tables in Vegas as quickly as possible? I'm inclined to believe it is that, but it's just not worth betting. I'm not willing to find out here, particularly as I believe the under is still juiced. Yeah, I'm looking at it now. I don't know if there's one posted at Bet Online, but based on some of the other ones I'm seeing, the under 1.5 is like minus 270. I don't know how you can look at the most recent results for Abdul-Malik and feel comfortable playing that, even if in theory this is one that should be over quickly if you're questioning Trócoli's motivations at all. So Abdul-Malik round 1 KO is my pick, but this one could end up dragging deeper and you could end up pulling your hair out if that ends up being the case. There's better spots on this card than this, and I would recommend investing in those over this one. The next fight is Iwo Baraniewski and Ibo Aslan, the highly anticipated Iwo versus Ibo matchup. Baraniewski is 6-0, fought on Contender Series week 6 this past season in mid-September, where he, as a I don't know about massive, but very well, it depends on how much we're talking in terms of massive relative to underdogs, but plus 230 is a pretty steep number, and he was a pretty hefty's a good term for this, hefty underdog against Muhammad Ali, the Brazilian Muhammad Ali, mind you, where he got a 20-second knockout win. That was the 6th win of his across all 6 of his pro MMA fights where he has earned a knockout in the first round. He has never gone beyond 4 minutes in any of his pro MMA appearances, all of which prior to Dana White's Contender Series took place in Babylon MMA. Not a promotion I can say I'm familiar with. And it's also worth pointing out that Muhammad Ali himself was 4-0 going into that fight. So only 5 MMA appearances after Contender Series pro ones under his own belt. I'm not sure if he had other kickboxing experience or whatnot, but that's something to bear in mind here relative to Baraniewski as we get further into this. Conversely, Aslan is 14-3. He's coming off what was one of, frankly, the most bizarre and sketchiest fights of the year at UFC. I believe it was Saudi Arabia. I don't know if it was Abu Dhabi or Saudi Arabia, but it was a card in the Middle East. It was Whitaker versus De Ridder, where he lost a unanimous decision, I believe 30-27 to Billy Elicana, where he was a very comfortable favorite, to the point that I made him a leg on at least one of, if not both of my parlays, the main ones that I put out for that card. Lost 30-27 on 2 cards, did get one of the rounds, but it was a horrible performance. Elicana hardly dominated the fight. He was just a little bit more active, and Aslan was very, very sloppy and not throwing at all. The thing that does concern me about Aslan here is that he was at Extreme Couture before, and it seems that he, for whatever reason, retreated from that camp. I don't know if it has something to do with his loss to Ion Cutelaba, if that happened before or afterwards, but he'd previously been at Extreme Couture, and he's now at Gym 23, which I believe is in his native country of Turkey. So you never really like seeing fighters that were previously at world-class camps, leave those camps to go to significantly less impressive ones. His head coach is a former UFC fighter, but again, it's just not the same level of refinement that you're getting from a camp like Extreme Couture that has so many members of the roster and is in direct proximity to the UFC headquarters in Vegas. But Baraniewski, I can't say I'm too familiar with Eli Gattore's Fight Club either. And again, this goes back to what I was saying about the level of competition here. I'm seeing this is a similar thing with what happened with Rafael Cerqueira, who Aslan beat inside of a minute in his last win that was a little bit over a year ago at this point. Cerqueira had a very similar resume to Baraniewski in where he was coming in undefeated to the UFC, having just totally walked over all of his competition, but he was fighting largely no names. And you can say a pretty similar case here with Baraniewski, where he has even less experience than Cerqueira does. Cerqueira had at least gone to decision in one of his previous fights, but obviously he got to the UFC level and just we saw that he wasn't really cut out, given he had been just basically can crushing on his way up. And in my estimation, it's kind of a similar story with Baraniewski here. Even the guy that he ended up fighting on Contender Series, you have to recall that there was a reason that he was priced the way that he was against Muhammad Ali. Like, they didn't just make him a plus 230 underdog for no reason. And he won under, frankly, pretty volatile circumstances in terms of that 20-second knockout. So this is a very volatile matchup in many respects. If Aslan loses here, he's probably on his way out. But I would have to imagine that if he's taking his fighting career seriously, which granted, if he was, you'd think he would have stayed at Extreme Couture instead of going home to Turkey, but I don't know what other personal motivations are involved there. In any event, this is going to be his third appearance this year, so it's not like the guy has been inactive or whatever. I have to go with the side that has the more UFC experience and has fought the notably higher level of competition here. Aslan, Anton Trócoli has already washed out, granted, and he lost the first fight before ultimately earning that revenge win early in his UFC run. But he also had a win over Robert Valentin before he fought Trócoli all the way back in 2018. So I would argue Valentin is as unimpressed as I am with Valentin, that's still a better name on his UFC resume than any of the wins that Baraniewski has on his. So I know that the common criticism with Aslan is he has no ground game, but even if Baraniewski has these, ground and pound knockouts on his resume, again, you have to consider the level of competition that it is here. And Aslan does have a good takedown defense stat that I think maybe not fully reflective of the ability, but is still pretty high at 86%. And again, he did get taken down and submitted by Cutelaba, but Cutelaba is so much better on than anybody that either of these guys have fought up and down on their records. So I'm not willing to hold Aslan's lack of ground game against him in this matchup, given there's so much from Baraniewski that we haven't seen that I frankly don't think really merits him being the favorite here. So I have to go with Aslan as the underdog. I'm going to say that he maybe has a slow start similar to what he did against Elikana, and he never ended up turning it up against Elikana. But he had a bit of a slow start in his first fight with Trócoli too, before he gradually built momentum. And there were a lot of the similar concerns that people were voicing about Aslan's ability to go late into fights was a common theme about why people were optimistic that Trócoli was going to beat him a second time, in addition to the difference in the ground skill set. But he showed in that fight, even though things didn't totally, I don't think, start on his side. I think he might have had a moment of damage at the end of the first round, but he gradually looked more impressive as that fight went on before he finally got the third round finish. I could see him deploying a similar game plan here to where he recognizes he has an opponent that has never been out of the first round professionally. He starts slow to kind of weather the best shots from Baraniewski before starting to turn things up in the second round, and I think he ultimately ends up getting a finish there. So I'm going to go Aslan by second round knockout, and he's going to also have length advantages here, both in terms of reach and height, that I think are going to support him as a favorite here. But it wouldn't shock me if Baraniewski ends up sparking him in the first round, just because it's a very volatile matchup. But there's more variables here, I think, in Aslan's favor that make him an attractive underdog in this spot. I can understand people being skeptical based on his last performance, but he was a hefty favorite there. And if he was a favorite here, I think I would understand more of the skepticism. But I don't know how you can feel comfortable about Baraniewski as an underdog, given he was just such a massive, or Baraniewski is a favorite given he was such a massive underdog in his last performance, and we only saw 20 seconds of him in what was probably the most competitive matchup he's had to date. So I'm going to lean on Aslan's experience and length advantages as the reason that he gets it done here. But again, it wouldn't shock me if Baraniewski's able to spark him. But give me the plus money on Aslan. I think he gets it done by second round knockout. The next fight is Jalin Turner and Edson Barboza. Turner enters 14-9 off of the first submission loss in his MMA career, which came at the hands of Ignacio Bahamondes at UFC 313. Turner now 1-4 in his last 5 after several points of frustration, decided to retire, I believe prior to his 30th, but yeah, a couple months prior to his 30th birthday, so when he was still 29. Seems to have had a change of heart and is now coming back and still fighting at lightweight a little bit surprisingly, but is going to make another run at it. Conversely, Edson Barboza is 24-13, has lost 4 of his last 6, including his last 2 in a main event to Lerone Murphy in May of last year, and in his most recent appearance at UFC 319 against Drakkar Klose. He was favored to beat Klose. I, along with Adam Martin and Marcel Dorff, all 3 of us on the MMA Oddsbreaker podcast, picked Klose as a unanimous underdog, consensus dog, as we call it on the show, or they call it on the show. I was happy to be a part in that case. To beat Klose, I enjoyed watching that fight in person. At 319, I was glad that they went. I felt Klose pretty clearly won that and probably could have even finished the fight. Maybe it was a little bit more conservative than he needed to be. I know some people were. I think there were more than a few people that thought Barboza won, but I don't think that would. I think most people would agree that Klose took that pretty handily and deserved to get a unanimous decision. There was a much worse unanimous decision earlier on that card that we'll get into with a fighter that is involved in a little bit here. But that being said, yeah, it's tough to feel good about where Barboza is at this stage of his career. 39 years old, had most of his success down a weight class as opposed to up at lightweight, and is now fighting one of the biggest lightweights on the roster. Even if you're concerned about where Turner's head is at, given the retirement decision, I want to give him some grace here, because if you go back and you look at the results that led to this guy's retirement, okay, I'll go back to the Mateus Gamrot fight. I picked Turner as an underdog in that one. There's a lot of people that felt like Turner won. I was disappointed. I understood giving the decision to Gamrot, but it was a split, and I think that you would be very, very hard-pressed to argue Gamrot won that fight based on damage. If you were scoring purely based on damage and striking, Turner probably deserved to get it. Gamrot did not really do much but hug and tie up the legs on the floor and try to prevent Turner from really doing anything. It was more of the, the common criticism of Merab is a kind of style that prevents any sort of fight from actually taking place. That was largely how Gamrot approached that one, because he recognized the danger that Turner was presenting. So one frustrating split decision. The Dan Hooker fight, even though people look very favorably upon Hooker for that result, it's important to remember that Turner was on his way to winning that one pretty comfortably before the end of the second round, where he got caught doing this kind of weird, like, bark thing. Like, it was more than an exhale. He, like, made an audible, like, sound, like, at Hooker towards the end of the second round. And in that moment of, like, doing that, Hooker stepped forward and hit him and hurt him and completely stole the round that Turner otherwise would have won pretty comfortably. If that moment doesn't take place at the end of that second round, Turner wins a 29-28 over Dan Hooker, and who knows how much more comfortable he feels about his career momentum if he does end up getting that win. Instead, he ends up losing a split. Bobby Green, that was, I don't want to call it a mercy killing, but it was one of the most brutal knockouts because of the ref that we've, the ref failing to stop the fight as soon as he needed to, that we've seen in recent memory. Then the Moicano fight happens at UFC 300, and Turner gets what should have been, in his estimation, a walk-off KO. I think it was Herb Dean that was the ref for that, and says, nah, you got to keep going. Moicano looked like he still had his wits about him and was able to survive to the end of the first round, but you can understand Turner with how bad the optics were. There's probably some other refs that would have stopped that fight, but of course the motto with Herb Dean is if he dies, he dies, and didn't let Turner get the win there. That fight goes to the second round. Moicano gets him on the floor, and Turner at that point is kind of mentally checked out. I don't want to say that there was a full-on adrenaline dump, given it's not like the fight was called, like what happened with Waldo Cortez's Acosta's fight about a month ago against, I can't remember what the guy's name is, but I believe he was Croatian, the guy that beat Marcin Tybura earlier this year. But again, you wonder if there was maybe a bit of like, oh, I should have had it, and then kind of checked out and resigned to his fate at that point. And then the Bahamondes fight happens. Turner's never been submitted. He gets submitted from the bottom by a triangle against a fighter that I believe at that point only had a couple of submission wins on his resume. So wounded pride combined with 3 results in which they could have easily gone his way. He's now 1-4, 29 years old, enjoys skateboarding presumably more than MMA. I can see why he probably felt like, you know what, I don't really need to keep doing this, and I'm killing myself to make 155 pounds every time and usually missing the weight anyway. I think this is probably it for me. Can understand why Turner probably felt like that. And then a couple months off, he probably realized, you know what, I can still make pretty good money doing this. I should get back in there. So I'm glad to see him back, because Jalin Turner at his best is one of the most dangerous fighters in the division. And we've seen that countless times over. You just wonder what the guy's ceiling is, given how many times he's bumped up against high-level fighters and just not quite gotten over the hump. I would like to see him go to a better camp than I think he's at Gracie Riverside. Given he is in California, you wonder how moving around to maybe some of the other camps nearby would probably, world-class camps nearby would presumably give him a little bit of a boost. But the guy's clearly, I mean, just one of the most dangerous all-around offensive fighters, and just such a problem at his size for anybody. Given that, and the fact that Barboza got outstruck by Drakkar Klose, of all people, at this stage of his career, I don't know how you can feel good about Barboza at all going into this one. I think really the only way that you're going to, I could see maybe Barboza taking the last round of this if Turner is starting to fade, given the weight cut, and he's already taken the first 2 rounds. But at that point, you're going to need Barboza to have somehow taken the second round away in order for him to end up getting a decision win here. And just given all the wars that the guy's been in, and the fact that he's fighting up now a weight class from where he was most successful previously against one of the biggest fighters at lightweight, I don't know how you can feel good about this at all. Both these guys have a lot of attrition, but this is one of the rare matchups for Turner where his opponent actually has much worse than he does. Barboza is going to have to thread a needle to win this one, and I just don't see it taking place for him. So I'm going to say Jalin Turner hurts Barboza in the first round and turns that into another club and sub opportunity for him. So give me Jalin Turner by first round sub. But just if you're the kind of better that likes props, just be careful with this one, because Turner could just as easily decide to ground and pound this one out after the knockdown as he could go for a club and sub, as we've seen him do in the past against fighters such as Brad Riddell. So I feel very good about Turner in this one. If this ends up ballooning out to something like 400, I'm not going to nearly like it. If he does end up missing weight, I'll probably want to see a bit of the line come in for Turner to where he goes to 200 before I feel good about playing him outright again. But I think 300 is pretty appropriate for, the expected result of outcome here. And if this weren't Turner coming out of a retirement, you wonder how much wider the line would even be than this, given the danger we know he presents relative to where Barboza's at this stage of his career. So give me Jalin Turner to win by first round submission. But I think this one gets Jalin Turner round one. Might just be the outright best prop play if you're targeting this one generally. The featured early prelim at UFC 323 is Marvin Vettori and Bruno Ferreira. Vettori enters 19-9-1 after losing his third fight in a row at UFC 318 in July. This time it was to Brendan Allen. It was a fairly one-sided affair for Allen, and frankly one that has to make you, like, this line is a pick'em, but I felt pretty good about Vettori in the underdog spot of the last fight if he had anything left, and the fact that he was so thoroughly outclassed by Allen in a fight that didn't really end up going anywhere other than the striking makes me very, very concerned about where Vettori is at generally. I want to believe in the guy, and I said that I was rooting for him, not only from the underdog perspective, but also him fighting in wake of the family tragedy. And I'll be rooting for him to get this one done here too. But I just don't know how you can feel good given the recent results that we've seen. Him losing to fighters that he had recently been. I mean, his last win was over a fighter that in the rematch he ended up losing to under 5-round circumstances, which are fights in which he was previously much more comfortable and had thrived in. So I don't know how you can feel good about Vettori in this spot, frankly, even if you have him graded to win, like I do in this case. But Bruno Ferreira, conversely, is 14-2. Last fought on the same card at UFC 318 against who I believe was like a day's notice replacement in Jackson McVeigh. Was able to get a first-round submission there after McVeigh looked okay early, but still kind of slow, and then was sloppy trying to take Ferreira's back. He slid off over the front, and then Ferreira from there was able to very quickly capitalize on top control position. I think ended up getting mount and then converted it into what I believe was an arm bar and was able to get a first round win there. That was actually, I believe, his second. I don't recall if he got an arm bar over Petrosian, but I know he got a second round submission win over Petrosian and exploited the fact that Petrosian really doesn't have any ground game whatsoever. And I believe Petrosian got cut off of that result as well. But yeah, as I said off the top, I don't know how you can feel good about Vettori given the three most recent performances. I was very, very confident in him going into his fight with Cannonier. Cannonier's obviously proven to be a unicorn in middleweight relative to his age many times over at this point, but still very, very concerning performance despite the fact that I think he ended up winning the first round of that fight before getting totally washed the last four. The Dolidze fight was even more concerning given he had been away from 2 years, came back. You were hoping to have an optimistic performance there. Instead of playing Vettori outright, I decided to take the over on rounds in that one, given I believe it was lined at 2.5 for a 5-round fight, which was kind of crazy to me, given that the first fight was also lined at 2.5. Might have been, I think it actually might have been 4.5, given it is a Marvin Vettori fight. But in any event, I felt comfortable taking the over, given I had gone to the well with it before against the same opponent. and that successfully cashed, which, spoiler alert, that's pretty much my same line of thinking for the main event. But yeah, not a good performance against Roman Dolidze. Did come back and get the third round to make it 2-1 going into the fourth after Dolidze took the first two, but still against an opponent that he arguably previously beat 30-27. I know some people had it scored 29-28 for Dolidze, or just 29-28 for Vettori in their first fight. Still a very discouraging performance against a fighter that he had previously looked much more impressive against within his last handful of results. And then the Brendan Allen fight, I wanted to believe in him as an underdog. Granted, Allen just had a really, really good performance against Ranier de Ridder after de Ridder was coming off of his own great performance against Whitaker. So Brendan Allen looks like a guy that, against all odds, may actually end up being some sort of contender at middleweight with one more impressive win under his belt, but is still probably behind at least Anthony Hernandez in the pecking order, given Hernandez's own success. And, I'll let you be the judge in terms of how you think Allen would do against a champ like Chimaev, or even against a number one contender like Dricus du Plessis, who still hasn't lost in the UFC to anybody other than Chimaev. That being said, what makes this fight most interesting, obviously, is Vettori's a decision machine, and Ferreira has never been the distance and has only been to round 3 once in his whole MMA career. So it's the unstoppable force versus the immovable block-headed object in some respects. Vettori obviously has the more impressive experience. I don't blame anybody for taking Vettori here under pick'em circumstances as the favorite, but I've been burned enough on Vettori money line at this point that I don't feel comfortable playing him straight up. What is easier for me to trust than Vettori's ability to win is Vettori's ability to endure and survive. The guy has had one of the best chins in the UFC for the entire time he's been in it. And he's facing another nuclear hitter here, but that was also the case when he was facing Dolidze, when he was facing Jared Cannonier, was still able to survive there. And, in his fights against Izzy that he both lost, when he was facing Kevin Holland, Paulo Costa, the guy has endured time in and time out. I don't see why anything different would be the truth here. Interestingly enough, this fight opened lined at +1.5 before that line got pulled down and since went back to 2.5. When I put the over 2.5 rounds out earlier this week, it was -140. I haven't checked at BetOnline how much it's moved, but according to what I'm seeing with the market at this point, it looks like the over 2.5 is now -155 at Bovada. Looks like it's -155 at Circa, -156 at Bovada. You can't make a call on Polymarket, I don't think, because I'm seeing at Polymarket it's -355. So maybe there's something wrong with the way Fight Odds is tracking stuff from prediction markets, because it looks extremely different relative to what the rest of the market says is going to happen. That being said, if you are somebody if that ends up being the case, that at Polymarket it's that much different, you see the difference in opinion in terms of the market thinking that fight is consistently going to go over -355 relative to how it's actually priced at the sports book. So I think that the over 2.5 is the much safer play here. I would feel much better about, if Ferreira wins, having an over 2.5 get spoiled by Ferreira winning than taking Vettori at a pick'em and then having Vettori finally suffer the first finish of his MMA career at the hands of Bruno Ferreira, and then you're suddenly holding a ticket with a fighter that's on a 4-fight losing streak. So yeah, I'm going to say this one goes over 2.5. I'm going to say Vettori gets a 29-28 where he loses the first round and then comes back and outpoints Ferreira down the stretch for a 29-28 win. But it wouldn't shock me at all here if Ferreira ends up getting the first decision win of his own career. I think that Ferreira winning by decision, frankly, is a more likely outcome than Vettori winning by finish, just because Vettori's finishing instincts have not been very good. And Ferreira, Yeah, he did get submitted by Abus Magomedov, so maybe Vettori finds a submission here. But Vettori has 2 knockout wins in his entire MMA career, and the last one happened. I'm not even sure if he has 2. Yeah, no, he does have 2, but it happened all the way back in December of 2015. So we're talking about a guy that hasn't won by knockout in literally a decade. So it's if you think it's going to happen inside the distance, it'll probably be Vettori by submission, with Ferreira getting tired maybe around round 3, same way it did against Magomedov. But he wasn't even tired against Magomedov, I don't think, in round 3. If you recall, he actually won the second round after dropping the first to Magomedov, and then I believe got reversed after trying to take Abus's back in round 3, and then giving up that bad position was ultimately, I think, arm triangled, and that's what ended up spelling doom for him. But in any event, I think that you probably have to feel much better about the over than you do about either side winning in this one. So I'm going with the safer one at what I estimate to be pretty good value. If it sticks around that range, I feel pretty good about making this one a leg, just because Vettori's chin has been one of the most reliable. Vettori's chin relative to his ability to not finish fights has been one of the most reliable trends in MMA year over year for the last, frankly, 5 years. So, and even before that, he's only got 2 finishes to his name in the UFC, and pretty much every other time he's gone the distance, win or lose or draw. So, yeah, give me the over 2.5 here. I think that's probably one of the best bets you can make on the card, and I'm gonna say that Vettori wins at 29-28. But if you're chasing the value here, I wonder what Ferreira by decision is. I'm gonna take a quick look at that now. Ferreira by decision is plus 420. If you're totally convinced that Vettori is washed, that might be worth a little bit of a sprinkle. But give me Vettori to win by 29-28. The first prelim rather at UFC 323 is Farés Ziam versus Nazim Sadykhov. Ziam enters 17-4. Last fought at Fight Night Adesanya Imavov. I believe that was UFC Saudi Arabia in February, where he beat Mike Davis, who looked like he was coming in with some sort of injury. But Ziam was still an underdog, I believe, at the time I put the pick out. Before I think he closed as the favorite in that one. And it ended up being the right call by the market. Yeah, he did. Oh no, he actually closed as the underdog. So yeah, I don't know if it was a pick 'em around the time that I played it, but in any event, he was an underdog and ended up being a great bet because he largely dominated that fight. And Davis did appear to be injured, I believe acknowledged as much after the fight, came in and pulled guard pretty quickly. But yeah, one of the bloodiest fights of the year, and and Davis showed good resolve and ended up hurting Ziam, I think, down the stretch a little bit. But Ziam, I think, still won a pretty comfortable decision there. I don't know if it was 30-27. It might have been 29-28, depending on how the last round was scored. No, it was a unanimous 30-27. So a great performance for Ziam. Conversely, Sadykhov last fought in his native Azerbaijan at Fight Night Hill Roundtree in June, where he scored what seems to be lost in the memory of the people backing Sadykhov this week. That was a comeback victory against Nicholas Mata, and frankly, one that probably should have been stopped when Mata was just raining down unanswered punches against the fence. I think if that fight is taking place anywhere other than Sadykhov's native Azerbaijan, that fight ends up getting stopped. But the ref gave him the longest leash he possibly could have. Mata ends up maybe losing a little bit of steam, chasing the finish so aggressively, and Sadykhov's able to get the comeback knockout. I had Sadykhov graded to win that one, but I did not feel comfortable at the price he was at. I said he was being too heavily valued as a favorite and that I was going to play the under. And what a brutal, that was a bad card for me overall, but that one particularly stung, seeing the under not cash there, which I think might have even been a plus money. But in any event, I was pretty frustrated not seeing the under take place on that one after how badly Mata had Sadykhov hurt early on and that I had advocated hedging off. But yeah, at the end of the day with this one, I'm kind of surprised the line is as close as it is. There's still so much skepticism about Ziam that I just frankly don't really understand. This guy is continued to improve and look really, really impressive in his recent performances. I know he was supposed to fight at UFC France and had to pull out due to a death in his family. I believe it was his grandmother. But it's nice to see him jumping back in before the end of this year and taking this matchup. Ziam is not somebody that has been fighting on margins during his 5-fight win streak. Yeah, you can write off the Figlak result if you want, given that guy didn't really stick around and it was 3 years ago. The Jai Herbert fight, fighting a striker that in the UK that offered similar length problems to Ziam. Ziam, I think on at least one scorecard, 130-27, if not 29-28 in that fight, and was able to beat Herbert at his own game in terms of being the long striker that likes to outpoint people. The Pugliese fight, there's no way that should have been a split. Pugliese had almost no moments of damage in that fight, and Ziam I don't think he was ever really in any legitimate danger of the submission attempts, but there were a lot of people that were skeptical of Ziam's ground game at that point that caused them to bet Pugliese. I don't know how Pugliese ended up getting a split result in that fight. I felt very, very comfortable that Ziam won a 29-28 outright in that one, and most people seem to agree. The Frevola fight, pure domination, one of the nastiest knockouts of last year with that knee that he ended up using to totally turn off the lights of Frevola. That was in Paris. Obviously, the crowd went nuts. Great result for Ziam. And the Mike Davis fight, yeah, Mike Davis was going into that with an injury, but it's not like the guy played with his food. He won, as I just stated, a 30-27 outright. You compare that to Sadykhov, that draw with Vyacheslav Borshev has not aged well at all. And that was a fight where I picked Sadykhov very comfortably. I didn't end up getting to watch the fight because I was attending a football game for my birthday that week. But from what I am told and recall, Borshev largely controlled 2 rounds before. The reason Sadykhov was able to get a 10-8 was because of a knockdown he landed, I believe, in the second round, and was able to very nearly finish Borshev, but Borshev, who I don't think has been knocked out before, was able to survive to the end, and obviously is just career has completely gone off the rails basically since then, other than a win I think he had over James Yantop after I believe that took place last year, after the Sadykhov fight that took place in November 2 years ago. Prior to that, I'm pretty sure he lost the first round to Terrance McKinney. I remember McKinney having his back, but McKinney wasn't able to get it done within the first 5 minutes and kind of had the typical McKinney meltdown. And he was able to come back, get a quick takedown to open the second round, and then ultimately, I think, choked out McKinney in his own right in that one, but still ended up losing the first round of that one. The Evan Elder fight, I had Sadykhov as a parlay leg that night, and I got, frankly, a little bit bailed out because he was on his way to losing that fight with Evan Elder before he opened up a cut at the beginning of the third round, and the doctor elected to stop the fight, and he ended up getting his first of what became 2 TKO victories by doctor stoppage during his UFC run. The second one was after the Borshev fight, in a fight against Bonfim, where he was largely losing the striking exchanges early before landing an awesome, I think it was a question mark kick, but massive head kick that really, really compromised Bonfim pretty badly. Bonfim went back to the corner at the end of the first and communicated he couldn't see out of one of his eyes, and at that point the doctor was obligated to stop the fight once he had verbally communicated that. And then the Mata fight, as I said, he lost that first round to Mata and probably would have gotten finished under any other circumstances. So you have one side that has consistently handled business in pretty dominant fashion when going the distance, and another side that has had an impressive run when you look at it on paper, but when you dig a little bit further under the surface, has been somewhat skating by on margins, and that draw sticks out like a sore thumb here. I don't see why Ziam isn't going to continue to do what he's done routinely. Sadykhov is probably going to force the action a little bit more than would be advised. May stay a little bit busier early, but I see Ziam landing much more cleanly and effectively and skirting the cage, fighting that kind of Ian Machado Gary style where he's just constantly perpetually in motion and picking you apart from distance. Making the most of his length advantages. He is going to have a super significant 6-inch reach advantage here and is also going to be the taller fighter by 3 inches. He's got quadruple the experience Sadykhov does going the distance, even though Sadykhov, I think, has pretty good cardio and has several late round finishes on his MMA resume. Both these guys have good cardio, but Ziam is just so much better at managing these point fights that I think he's going to steer this one into. I think the knockout upside for both these guys is pretty good. I think you have to give Sadykhov the submission upside, but not necessarily a ton of it, because I just don't see him being able to put this fight on the ground for 15 minutes. Even if he does end up getting it down there, I think Ziam has shown enough improvements in that area that he'll be able to defend any forthcoming submission attempts, get back to his feet, and put this fight back on his own terms. I've got Ziam here very, very confidently. I think he's going to get a 30-27 decision, but I don't think a knockout is out of the question either. I'll be a little bit... it'll be interesting to see how Sadykhov does early, but I think the longer this one goes, the more Ziam's going to look comfortable and really put a stamp on and dominate this one. This guy is a dangerous name to monitor at lightweight and not even in his prime yet and already building very good experience at 28 years old. So I think Ziam's going to remind a lot of people just why there was so much optimism about him coming off of that Frivola result last year. And I'd say that he gets if not a statement finish, at least an impressive, dominant point fighting victory in this one. So I think Ziam is one of the best value plays on this card, frankly, at -130, -135 is where he's sitting right now. So give me Fares Ziam by 30-27 unanimous decision. The next fight is Maycee Barber and Karine Silva. Barber enters 14-2, has not fought since March of last year at UFC 299, where she beat Caitlin Seminara, formerly Chukagian, by pretty dominant one-sided decision win. Was supposed to main event against Erin Blanchfield earlier this year, but did not make the walk. Weighed in, missed weight, but did not make the walk, and that fight ultimately got canceled. At that point, you had to be very, very concerned about where Barber's career was headed. Cosmetic surgery notwithstanding. She had kind of communicated she had been dealing with some health issues even prior to that, but it's important to remember she was pretty aggressive in her trash talk with Blanchfield leading into that fight, and then to not even make the walk was a really bad look. I don't know if she had trouble making 125 previously, but I know that she had fought at bantamweight previously. So I was surprised when I saw this matchup that the UFC, after she missed weight and then had a health issue that may or may not have been tied to her having a bad weight cut, the UFC allowed her to continue trying to fight at flyweight for this one. Given the rule in Nevada apparently is if the main event doesn't happen, all the attendees are obligated to receive a refund. So I can't imagine the UFC made any money on that Apex card. Thankfully, it was an in-house show, so I don't know how much they actually would have lost on that. But I think that that's something worth bearing in mind here, that they're not only willing to let her fight again at flyweight, but are even interested in giving her another matchup this year. It must say something about where, how they feel about her relative to a promotional sell and just where she's at in her career going forward at 27 years old. Conversely, Karine Silva is 19-5, last fought at UFC 319, where she got a unanimous decision win over Dion Barboza that, in a revenge spot, by the way, after losing to Barboza earlier in her career, she was favored to win, and she did get the revenge win, but frankly, I don't think she deserved it. There's very split opinions on who won that fight, which are not reflected by the fact that it was a unanimous decision. I was surprised it wasn't at least a split. Frankly, when they announced it was a unanimous decision at UFC 319, when I was in attendance, me and the crowd in tandem, we all thought that Barboza was going to win. When Silva's name was read as the winner, I was frankly surprised. The crowd booed in agreement with that surprise and disgust at the decision. I saw a lot of people that were watching at home that did think that Silva won, but rewatching that fight again this past week, I don't understand why Silva was given that win, frankly. I don't think that she did anything to win the second round at all. There was Joe Rogan talking up the dead orchard submission attempt where Barboza had both of her arms in while Silva was attempting the triangle. But the typical thinking with these triangle attempts, which Rogan even admitted himself, or maybe it was DC, was you either want both arms in or both arms out, not one or the other. When you've got one arm in, regardless of which one it is, that is the one when you're more susceptible to getting triangle choked. Barboza had both of her arms in and never appeared to be in any danger. And we continue to see too many people value striking attempts from the bottom as opposed to rewarding the opponent that has gotten the top control. And as long as they're not doing, a Jalin Almeida lay and pray routine, and they're at least doing something from top with total strikes, you've got to reward that over anything that's being done from the bottom, even if it ends up miraculously opening some cut because they're just doing the 12-6 elbows while they're on their back, not really doing anything to get back up. I thought it was a bad decision. Many people agreed. I was upset because that was one of two consensus dogs I put out on the podcast preview for that I did with Adam Martin and Marcel Dorf, but we at least got your car close. It is what it is. And on that show, even though I didn't put them out myself, I did pick Tim Elliott and Lerone Murphy to win in their main card fights as well as underdogs. So I had more than a few dog picks. I hesitate to call the latter two picks because I didn't put them out on Twitter, but the ones that I verbally professed that I thought were going to win did end up doing that. Could have been a sweep if they gave it to Barboza, but alas, that didn't end up taking place. But I keep that in mind relative to Silva could easily be on a 2-fight losing streak coming into this one. I feel like Barber would be a much, much bigger favorite if there weren't the questions about her health coming into this. So I think that we're actually getting her at a very good value of -185. And again, even though I picked Blanchfield to beat her, and I think Blanchfield was something like a 2-1 favorite, I know there were a lot of people that were optimistic about Barber before that fight ended up falling apart. If we get anything close to the Barber that we saw in her two most recent appearances, she's beaten fighters that have accomplished more than what Silva has. And Silva has been proven to be a little bit of an atypical front runner of sorts relative to women's MMA, where she's more of a threat earlier in the fight to get the finish and has faded late. The Viviane Araujo fight from a year ago really stands out in that regard, especially after Araujo got cut following her next fight against Tracy Cortez, where I actually was so encouraged by what Araujo showed against Silva that I picked her to beat Cortez, and she ended up getting rinsed pretty badly, 30-27, fought a poor game plan, never really got that fight to the ground, and actually I think even ended up pulling guard late in that fight and surrendering top position to Cortez. Just a bad look, but a worse look for Silva to have lost to a fighter like that, frankly, when she was so heavily favored to beat Araujo. Now she's getting a younger fighter that has accomplished more in the earlier stages of her career and has frankly looked better in just about every way other than frequency of submission attempts and amount of takedowns landed. But Barber still has pretty good wrestling credentials with the time that she spent at Team Alpha Male. But frankly, I could easily see her, provided that she makes the walk and the weight, weathering an early storm from Silva and coming back and taking the last two rounds pretty handily and getting at least a 29-28, if not looking more impressive from the jump and getting a 30-27. I think Barber's the better all-around fighter here and has proven to be a better fit for women's MMA than what Silva has given the typical women's MMA fighter. The question is just going to be, how does Barber look on the walk? does she successfully make the weight this time, given her recent cosmetic adjustments? And just where is her health at after such a falling apart of a main event? But the fact that the UFC is not only willing to give her another fight this year, but fight at flyweight makes me at least want to give her the benefit of the doubt that she's figured out what she has to do in order to keep her career on the right track. And the UFC has acknowledged as such by putting her in this spot. So I'm going to say Barber wins a 29-28 by taking the last 2 rounds. I think that she's maybe Silva's got a little bit better the finishing upside early, but I think Barber's going to have much more of it late and is just going to be the better fighter after the first 5 minutes. The question is, how competitive is it within the first 5 minutes, and does Barber end up making that walk and making the weight? But even if she ends up missing weight here, I think I still feel pretty good about where she's at in terms of winning this one. It's just going to be a matter of, does she have another episode like what happened against Blanchfield? But I don't see that happening. I think this is a good bounce back spot for her. So give me Maycee Barber to win by 29-28 decision. The next fight is Chris Duncan and Terrance McKinney. Duncan enters 14-2. He is coming off of what was considered to be one of the candidates for fight of the year against Mateusz Rebecki at Fight Night Tyra versus Park back in August. That was a fight that could have been scored either way, but Rebecki, the aesthetics were so bad all over his face, even though Duncan was bloodied up in his own respects, that Duncan did end up getting a unanimous 29-28 to the chagrin of myself, because I would have had a very good event that night had Rebecki been scored the decision win. But Duncan did get the job done, did lose the first round, which is a little bit of a theme of his that I think plays interestingly into this matchup, but we'll get into that in a moment. McKinney, conversely, is 17-7, has now won back-to-back fights after submitting Vyacheslav Borshev within the first minute at UFC 317. Prior to that, got a knockout in just over 2 minutes against Amir Hadzovic earlier this year at Fight Night Adesanya versus Imavov. Has his own handful of pretty brutal losses on his resume, but yeah, McKinney is pretty much the ultimate killer be killed fighter in the UFC. Very, very potent finisher and brilliant athlete, but has left a lot desired, I think, in terms of the game plan and just kind of where his head goes after 5 minutes if he's not, getting his opponent out of there pretty quickly. But McKinney unders have been one of the most free bets in the UFC since he stepped into it. Pretty much just about as free as the guy fighting after him on this card, which we'll talk about in a moment. But yeah, McKinney is now an underdog for this one, given Duncan's, the market is starting to figure out a little bit that they shouldn't really be disrespecting Duncan. It is funny that Duncan lost to Borshev on his first Contender Series appearance, and McKinney, got Borshev at a much better time relative to McKinney's own career and was able to have a much different degree of success. But I think it's worth going back here and looking at a lot of what Duncan has done in his UFC career in terms of like just jumping out and making this guy the favorite. I don't recall why the Morales fight ended up being a split. I think Duncan probably had more success earlier on in that one, and maybe Morales came on a little bit late, but Morales was at the end of his career in that one, even though I think he was favored to win. He was favored to beat Ashmouz. Ashmouz broke his arm very early in that fight, and that's why Duncan was kind of largely able to run away with it. The Manuel Torres fight, he got overwhelmed very, very quickly, and Torres, which is what Torres does to everybody, as we're going to talk about in the fight after this, and I don't know if it was a club and sub, but he definitely got rear naked choked, which is something that I think McKinney would be more than well served to replicate in his own right. Balaji Oki, he was an underdog in that fight. Oki was getting the better of him for pretty much the entirety of the fight, nearly tripled up Duncan on significant strikes in the opening round before Oki inexplicably made the decision to shoot a takedown, which Duncan turned into a guillotine and then was able to tap out Oki. I'll never understand why Oki, after the success he was having on the feet, opted to try to bring that one to the floor. It ended up spelling doom for him in that case. The Vucenic fight, I had Duncan graded a win in that one, but given what happened against Oki, I was too hesitant to play it. And I that was one of two massive underdogs I stayed off on that card. The other one being Cowie Fernandez against Guram Kutataladze, and opted to play some other spots in that card that didn't end up working out. That was a brutal. That day was brutal in terms of a lot of the judging the UK fighters received, but it was also brutal in the sense that I graded two massive underdogs to win, but was too cowardly to put them out for the public to consume and take advantage of, unfortunately. But he did handle Vucenic pretty well as a massive underdog, and then went into the Rebecki fight as an underdog again. And despite losing the first round, which you're seeing a theme here, was able to come back and win a 29-28. But this guy, part of the thing that's been so fascinating about his run here is that the guy's inexplicably grown a chin after getting knocked out by Borshev on Contender Series and then nearly losing his fight to Charlie Kemble in his second Contender Series appearance, where he got knocked down. It didn't get scored a knockdown, but he got hurt multiple times in that fight before he was able to land a counter on Campbell, where Campbell got actually scored as a knockdown and was eventually knocked out by a follow-up hammer fist, I believe, even though I think he was probably out by the time that he went down. And maybe that had something to do with him chasing the finish. But in any event, we've seen Chris Duncan routinely drop first rounds, look bad in first rounds, and get hurt in first rounds before ultimately turning things around and coming back and getting wins. He's been very good at it. And it's possible he does it here against McKinney. But McKinney, more often than not, when he has had early success, has been able to turn that into wins and has done it against, frankly, better competition than what Duncan has faced to this point. The one time where that did, there's a couple times where that didn't end up being the case. The Drew Dober fight, where he took that, I believe, on like 2 weeks after he got his win over Farés Ziam, where he was an underdog in that spot as well, and was able to hurt Dober early, but Dober was able to weather the storm, come back and knock him out in his own right. And Dober, I mean, that was Drew Dober at the peak of his powers before there was a little bit of the more recent decline that we've seen from Dober. The Bonfim fight, he never really got anything going. The Sadykhov fight, I talked about it earlier. McKinney was having more success in the early going for that, but then Sadykhov was able to turn the tables and get the finish in the second round. The Ribovics fight, that fight was over in less than 45 seconds. But Ribovics, even though him versus Duncan, I think, would be a great fight in its own right, Ribovics not dealing with much better chin, not dealing with nearly the same level of attrition and moments of being hurt that Duncan has had at this point in his career. I felt pretty good about, which is why Ribovics, I believe, was like something at least like a 3-1, if not more, favorite against McKinney in that fight. The under was always the way to go there. I've routinely played the unders with McKinney just because of how free they've been. But this is, I believe, he was an underdog against Ribovics. I didn't feel good about playing him in that spot. But this is, I believe, going to be the first time he's been an underdog since the Sadykhov fight, where he wasn't able to get it done there. He was favored over Bonfim. I do remember that at UFC 283. But I think this is probably the most winnable spot for him in terms of him being an underdog than where he's been at previously, because Sadykhov and Ribovics have just proven to be much more durable. Duncan has shown a tendency to get overwhelmed, like if not get outright overwhelmed, at least drop the first round on the basis of damage and just the other fighters that have been like not accomplished what McKinney has, being worse. So I think McKinney's going to swarm him and get a first round knockout, frankly. Possibly club and sub, but I really think McKinney's in a good spot here to get what would be the biggest win he has had on his resume since the upset over Farés Ziam. I want to believe in the idea of McKinney, but obviously the the game planning past 5 minutes has been enough of a concern that, yeah, if this does get out of the first round, I think Duncan is probably going to handle it. But it is interesting to point out that even though that is the narrative against McKinney has won fights that have gone into round 3 before. It was just the fourth fight of his career all the way back in 2018. Pretty much everything else has gone under. So the problem here is with the under is that the market seems to have finally figured out that you cannot really be, not that you can't be playing these, certainly not. But last time I checked, it was like minus 350. So the market seems to have figured out that, okay, McKinney is pretty much committed to kill or be killed within the first 7.5 minutes. So I would much rather take the value on McKinney here that he's going to be able to overwhelm Duncan than the risk of, okay, what if McKinney doesn't end up finishing this in the first 5 minutes? Duncan probably ends up getting a win early in round 2, or at least you would need to bank on that if McKinney doesn't end up winning in round 1. And then you're holding a minus 350 ticket, hoping for an early second round finish that may or may not actually manifest. So yeah, I feel like one of these lines is probably incorrect. Either the minus 350 has way too much juice on it because Duncan is the favorite, and it would presumably stand to benefit him to drag this into the deeper rounds where McKinney has far less success than he does early, or McKinney swarms him if the minus 1.5 is accurate and wins, in which case McKinney probably shouldn't be the underdog, or this should at least be a pick'em. I'm going to take the plus money on McKinney and say that he overwhelms Duncan, as Duncan has shown a tendency to have with less success in the first round than later in fights based on his recent UFC run. So give me Terrance McKinney to pull the upset. I don't know about wake the crowd up. Maybe I will say wake the crowd up after a Marvin Vettori fight that goes to decision, a Farés Ziam outpointing, and a women's MMA fight that probably goes the distance. Give me McKinney to wake the crowd back up with a round 1 knockout via ground and pound after sparking Duncan by just kind of rushing in pretty early on. So yeah, Rex gonna give it to you. The featured prelim at UFC 323 is Grant Dawson and Manuel El Loco Torres. Dawson enters 23-2-1, last fought at UFC 311 at the beginning of this year, where he got a pretty dominant one-sided unanimous decision over Diego Ferreira. He was favored to do as much. There were a lot of people wondering if Ferreira, given how impressive he had looked recently and his punching power, if he was going to be able to capitalize on Dawson's chin, was just a little too hesitant in that fight ever getting going. You heard his coaches very, very audibly getting frustrated with him. And ultimately that just didn't end up working out for Ferreira in any capacity in that fight whatsoever. But Dawson did a good job putting that fight on his terms. Looked honestly a little bit better in the striking than I think he has recently, but especially given the level of opponent, but he still knew where his bread was buttered and did everything he could to keep the fight on the ground in that one to avoid getting sparked. El Loco Torres got a bounce back win to move his record to 16-3 at Fight Night Moreno Urseg earlier this year, where he knocked out Drew Dober in round 1. And that is probably the most impressive win he's had in his own right. Prior to that was in a fight that I think was a pick'em at Noche UFC last year, where he got knocked out by Ignacio Bahamondes. But if you're a believer in Torres unders being free, as I alluded to in the last breakdown, with the same applying to McKinney, you still ended up cashing in that one. Definitely should have played that one over believing that Torres would get it done. But Torres finishing Dober in the fashion that he did, still, I think, turned some heads back around on him in terms of, I'm sure everybody loves to invoke fraud check when somebody loses, like the one that he did to Bahamondes. But Bahamondes is a great fighter at lightweight in his own right. So no shame in that loss, and a good bounce back for him. The thing is, given the UFC experience and the on paper well-rounded skill set, at least demonstrated by the stats that Dawson has shown, when I look at all the variables for this one, It's got Dawson graded very, very comfortably. The thing is, my gut and the eye test tell an extremely different story about this fight, and it's why I'm going to be so fascinated to watch this one, which is funny because a lot of people I know are dreading Dawson turning this into a lay and pray 30-20. It's funny, all the the crotch sniffing allegations that everybody loves throwing at the Dagestani wrestlers. Grant Dawson is like the Dagestani that Team Khabib left behind in Nebraska and was raised up in the Nebraska wrestling scene. Fights the exact same style and gets, I guess, a similar amount of grief, but isn't given nearly the amount of disdain that the Tagiru and Bekovs and Makhachevs and Khabibs are by the casual fans. But I know a lot of people were thrilled to see him lose the fight that he did to Bobby Green when Dawson finally did end up getting the main event call up. But I think that explains a lot why he's been largely left off the main cards of a lot of his fights. And you look at a lot of the recent competition that Dawson has had. I don't know if he's ever faced this combined threat of youth, pressure, striking power, and takedown defense that Torres presents here. And that makes this kind of a nightmare matchup for Dawson if he isn't able to put this on the floor. You go back and you look at the results from when he drew. I mean, you can go through and review all of Dawson's UFC run, really. The Julian Erosa fight went to decision. He was able to get the win there, but Erosa, I don't think, has ever really had great takedown defense. Has been more than willing to play jiu-jitsu off of his back. We saw that against I'm blanking on the name, but Darren Elkins at UFC 314, even, he was willing to go off of his back because, granted, he was confident enough that Elkins was going to get hurt, but we still saw Rosa fighting off of his back in that one, which shows you that he was comfortable enough playing in guard there that probably lend itself to what happened against Dawson as well. Trezano, tough winner that washed out of the UFC. Derek Minner, one of the most controversial names in terms of betting on the sport in recent memory. But Minner was pretty much a first round submission or bust fighter. Nad Narimani, I'll be honest, couldn't tell you much about the guy. Leonardo Santos was a guy that around the time he was fighting in the UFC was pretty old at the end of his UFC run, and Dawson still couldn't finish him until the very, very final second of that one. But he was a pretty decently sized lightweight from what I remember. The Ricky Glenn fight got fought to a draw. Dawson, I think, won the first 2 rounds, and then Glenn arguably got a 10-8, which offered some cardio skepticism, I guess, about Dawson that I don't think he really ever frankly deserved. But the Jared Gordon fight got a late submission win in that one, but Gordon, even though he's a good, well-rounded fighter and does have decent power in his hands, was never really the same kind of pressure threat and has pretty average, like right around UFC average takedown defense, not really comparable to what Torres was offering or offers coming into this. Marco Madsen, pretty much, older combat sports veteran, largely leaning on his silver Olympic wrestling credentials for his country of Denmark. Ismagulov, I've seen a lot of people point to that as Dawson being able to dominate other competent grapplers with good takedown defense. All I have to say about that one is, obviously, the fight night from that one is one of the proudest moments of my entire betting career. And one of the reasons I got a sweep that night was because I took Dawson in what was lined as a pick'em. And it's funny that when people invoke the term wiki capper, because if you went to the Wikipedia page for Damir Ismagulov before that fight, you would have seen a source cited from a Russian, or I think it was Russian or Kazakhstani news outlet, that explained that Ismagulov had communicated to them that he had retired and had come out of retirement for this last fight on his UFC contract. That made me feel very good about picking Dawson in that matchup. And Dawson not only won a 30-27, but even put Ismagulov in a full Nelson. So he was hardly facing the best version of Ismagulov going into that fight. The same guy that I believe beat Guram Kutat a lot, and I think he might have beaten Gamro too earlier in his run, but it was hardly Ismagulov at the height of his powers. But that event prompted the main event where he got knocked out by King Green in 30 seconds. Joe Selecki, pure grappler, that is out of the UFC now in his own right. Rafa Garcia, very durable fighter, but not necessarily the most impressive, especially in terms of finishing upside guy, was largely a decision machine. That was arguably the most impressive win Dawson has had because he was the first person to finish Rafa Garcia and did it inside of 1.5 rounds. And then the Diego Ferreira fight, impressive, but again, Ferreira, I don't know if he was 40 at the time the fight took place, but I believe he's at least 40 now. So certainly at the end of his own MMA career. None of those guys are offering in the entire career that Dawson has had the same mixture of what I said off the top in terms of both. He's similarly, the two of these guys are similarly sized, but the pressure, the power, the takedown defense, and being in the prime of their career, there's been fighters offering select of those elements, but never the combination of the four. Torres, all of the guys' finishes are just absolutely nasty pieces of work. He's averaging, largely because all of his fights have taken place in the first round, but the guy is averaging nearly 8 significant strikes landed per minute during his UFC run now, and boasts 88% takedown defense. So you have to think that he's at least going to be able to give Dawson more resistance in that area than he's used to, even if Dawson is able to get the fight to the ground. I got a hedge here because my gut thinks that Torres is going to absolutely do to Dawson the same thing that Bobby Green did. And Dawson, the problem with him is the guy is undeniably chinny. Flip side of that is, yeah, maybe Dawson takes him down and lays on him for 15 minutes. But what makes me feel pretty good about hedging on an under here, in addition to how it's priced, is Torres, all of his losses and all of Dawson's losses, every time both of these guys have lost in their MMA careers, which has happened 5 times, all of them have been inside 7.5 minutes. Now, the 2 cases of where Torres has been submitted, it was a heel hook and a knee bar. So I don't necessarily know if Dawson is going to go that route, given he's pretty much only won by rear naked choke during his UFC run. But the guy is obviously very, very savvy with the submissions and is training at American top teams. So the fight does go to the ground, he would be well served to look to finish in that capacity. And he finished a guy within his last 2 appearances in Rafa Garcia that had never been finished inside of 7.5 minutes. So I don't necessarily think that we're in a position where he's not going to be looking to finish early in this fight if it gets to that point. And every time that Torres has lost, it's been inside of 7.5 minutes. So I would much rather be holding a chalk ticket on an under that doesn't cash because Dawson opted to lay and pray and didn't end up getting chinned by a fighter that had previously chinned all but one of his opponents, except for maybe Duncan, but still ended up submitting him early in that fight, than holding a Dawson ticket and watching the guy get detonated on. And then the whole MMA audience after this happened is like, oh, of course this was going to happen. It's the same thing that happened with Bobby Green. So I feel great about the under in this spot, -150. But again, given how confident of a grade I have, the model is saying Dawson wins in dominant fashion, whether that's a 30-27 or a first round finish. My gut and the eye test are telling me Torres is going to get the first round knockout, and that's what I'm going to pick to happen. But my official play for this is going to be the under 1.5 rounds, which is why I'm so fascinated to see how this one plays out, because I don't feel like I have a great read on it in terms of who actually wins, but I feel like I have a great read on it in terms of what the result is going to be, regardless of which side ends up earning it. So I think violence is absolutely on the table here. I'm going to be saying that Torres gets the first round knockout within that 1.5 rounds, but the under is going to be my official betting play here as opposed to picking a side outright. So do with that what you will, but if you're looking for the safer play here, I think the under is the safer bet as opposed to siding with one of the two combatants in this case. The main card opener at UFC 323 is Jan Blachowicz and Bogdan Guskov. Blachowicz enters 29-11-1, last fought at Fight Night Edwards versus Brady in London, where he lost a unanimous decision against Carlos Ulberg that I frankly agreed with, but there were a lot of people that didn't like the safe point fight that Ulberg kind of fought in that one. That scored the fight for Blachowicz. In defense of those people, one judge, even though it was a unanimous 29-8 for Ulberg, I think a couple judges gave round 1 at least to Blachowicz, and one judge gave round 3 to Blachowicz. That might be flipped. It might have been 2 gave him round 1, 2 gave him round 3. But in any event, there is a conceivable universe in which, if you're judging that fight, you can give round 1 and round 3 to Blachowicz and score him the winner. In the case of the judges sitting ringside, they didn't do that. They all saw 29-28 in different capacities for Ulberg. So by that same token, you could say Ulberg won 30-27, even though none of the scorecards reflected that. But it was another close fight against a contender-level fighter for someone in Blachowicz who has continued to make a habit of that even in the twilight of his career. Conversely, Guskov is 18-3, last fought at Fight Night Whitaker to Ritter in July, where he got a first-round knockout over Nikita Krylov as an underdog in a fight where Krylov fought probably the stupidest game plan possible relative to the obvious grappling exploits he could have had in that fight that he didn't make any sort of attempt to take advantage of, which has kind of been a theme for Guskov during his UFC run, because he first, and it was a short notice appearance for him, in fairness, but he did get submitted by Volkan Oezdemir in his debut. And Oezdemir at that point only had one submission win in his entire MMA career, and that remains only the second submission win Oezdemir has had against any opponent during his MMA career. The Zach Pauga fight, I believe Pauga was cut shortly after, but Pauga was like a 300 favorite. I took Pauga because I had no estimation Guskov was going to be anywhere near the rankings, and we're now in a position where Guskov could potentially end up being a top 5 fighter in this weight class with a win in this spot. I think that says more about the state of light heavyweight than it does about Guskov, but we'll see what ends up happening. The Ryan Spann fight, Spann comfortable favorite, felt comfortable playing him, was dominating the first round largely on the basis of the grappling. If Spann had just gone back to doing that for the next 2 rounds, he would have won a very dominant 30-27. Instead, Spann opted to try striking instead of going back to the grappling in the second round. Guskov caught him and was able to get a comeback win under those circumstances. The Elikana fight, Elikana was having grappling success of his own on a day's notice debut against Guskov. But Guskov was able to ultimately turn that fight around and win by his own submission attempt a little over halfway through the second round of that fight. But again, day's notice appearance for Elikana, can't put much stock into that. And then Krylov, again, if Krylov fights the optimal game plan in that one, much like Spann, he ends up getting that win, and that doesn't end up happening. So I think Guskov has largely been, the recipient of poor game planning thanks to his opponents rather than, getting any sort of super impressive results. You still have to come back in the circumstances that he did against Ryan Spann. And, but again, I remain unimpressed, whereas I don't know how you can't be impressed with what Blachowicz is doing in the twilight of his career. Granted, the loss to Teixeira was pretty straightforward, but there's a universe in which he beats Ankalaev for the title in a fight that was scored as a draw. There's a universe in which he beats Alex Pereira. I had Blachowicz to beat Pereira that night, but I think that was a case of, in terms of promotional push, the UFC placing the cart before the horse, recognizing Pereira's star potential, that they wanted to get him a title shot. That ended up being the right call in terms of fostering growth of the UFC, because Pereira ultimately became arguably the biggest star that the company has at the moment and is now on his second championship run in the weight class. That being said, I think that in a purely just universe, Blachowicz should have been scored that fight. It largely just comes down to how you score round 3. And then the Carlos Ulberg fight, as I alluded to, you could have scored that fight either way. I thought Ulberg won, but there's a universe in which Blachowicz ends up getting that 29-28 on the basis of round 1 and round 3. And that was coming off of a nearly 2-year layoff under those circumstances. Blachowicz is not the kind of guy that's going to fight a silly game plan. If he was, he would have invited a striking matchup with Israel Adesanya when Izzy was undefeated and trying to become a 2-belt champion. And instead, Blachowicz fought the fight that he knew Adesanya wasn't going to be able to handle with well up a weight class, and ended up dominating that one pretty handily. He fought to his strengths against Pereira. It just didn't end up working out the right way. It was a little weird that he didn't try to more feverishly take the fight to the floor against Ulberg, but Ulberg is obviously super athletic and has very good takedown defense. So who's to say? I was surprised, frankly, that he didn't opt to put it that way, but it's not like I think he fought. You can't say that he fought a bad game plan against Ulberg, because he very nearly won the fight in his own right and did win in the estimation of many people. So if an opponent fights a good game plan against Guskov, I think they're going to be able to exploit it. I don't know how Blachowicz can look at what Oezdemir did to Guskov and say, okay, I can't do this. I can submit this guy round 1. I'm a better all-around MMA fighter than this guy is. Even if this fight doesn't go to the floor, I don't know how you can look at what Blachowicz did against Ulberg and say what this guy has done against higher-level strikers than Guskov is nothing short of impressive. Guskov is not nearly as defensively responsible of a fighter as Blachowicz is. He is a very, very hard hitter at a very much younger stage of his career. So if you want to play him on that basis, the fact that you're not usually getting these nearly decade-wide age gaps where the younger guy is the underdog, I can't blame you for it in theory. But this is also a guy in Guskov that has gone the distance once and I believe lost the only decision of his MMA career. Maybe it was a split. No, he did lose the only decision of his MMA career, and it wasn't even a 3-round decision. It was a 2-round decision all the way back in 2016. What happens if Blachowicz doesn't get nuked in the first round? Granted, Guskov did come back and win in the second round against Ryan Spann, but that was one of the most notoriously poor game planners in the UFC in Spann. Yeah, if Blachowicz doesn't get nuked here, I think he's going to cruise. I think he's pretty good value for what his price is. I don't know if I feel good about making him a parlay leg just because he is a 42 and, there could be at that age deterioration overnight. But if there was going to be outright deterioration for Blachowicz, you would have thought that it would have happened in his last appearance given the layoff, and he actually looked pretty competent against a guy that's probably about to fight for the title in Ulberg. I don't know how I can understand in theory why you would feel good about Guskov, but looking at all the variables here, how much more experience Blachowicz has in high-level UFC fights against high-level opponents, going the distance and fighting a more well-rounded MMA skill set than what Guskov has demonstrated, I don't see a lot of avenues to Guskov here beyond first-round bonk, which is easier said than done against a guy in Blachowicz who has never been finished in the first round of his entire MMA career. There was, I think, what might have been a doctor's stoppage in the only TKO fight he suffered before the UFC in KSW all the way back in 2011. And then he was knocked out at the beginning of the third round by Thiago Santos in 2019. Other than those 2 results, the guy's never been knocked out. His only other 2 losses by finish have been submissions. And if one guy's going to submit the other here, I think it'd be very far-fetched to have Guskov do it if it's not something like a club and sub where Blachowicz is visibly compromised. I'm going to say that Blachowicz wins a 30-27 here. Wouldn't surprise me if it's a 29-28. But I think he's going to be well served to extend this fight. It'll be interesting to see if Guskov is tired going into a third round that he's never seen, and ends up getting, well, has he been to the third? I'm sorry, that's not correct. He has been, even though he's never fought to a 3-round decision, he has been to the third round. He has one win in the third round of his MMA career. That was back in 2019. So he has been to a third round. So maybe there isn't a lot of reason to be concerned about the guy's cardio, but going the distance is more than just about having the gas tank. It's about making the adaptations that you need to in fights to win back rounds and come back under circumstances where you may have been losing, or to put a stamp on victory. And it's undeniable that Blachowicz has more experience and is better suited to doing that because he's done it 21 times in his MMA career compared to only once for Guskov. So I think there's very, very clear paths to victory here for Blachowicz. More clear paths to victory than what Guskov has, where I think Guskov, it's going to be first round KO or bust. I feel great about him winning here. I just don't know if I feel good about betting him given the age he's at 42 years old. But we'll see how things shape. We'll see how they both look at the weigh-ins, but give me Blachowicz to win by 30-27 decision. The next fight is Peyton Talbot and Henry Cejudo. Talbot enters 10-1-0, last fought at UFC 317 this year, where he had a great bounce-back win against Felipe Lima after losing what might have been the largest betting upset in UFC history to Raoni Barcelos as like a over -1,000 favorite at UFC 311 earlier this year, where Barcelos, I think, might have even gotten 30-27, if not 29-28. In any event, Talbot, given he's turned 27 in September, was 26 at the time he fought Lima, was at the age where he can continue to rapidly make improvements, and did so, showing, I mean, the craziest thing about the way that he won the Lima fight was that even though Lima arguably looked more impressive in the striking, Talbot actually looked more impressive in the grappling, and particularly in the grappling defense, reversing position on Lima several times, and getting the better damage from top control positions than what Lima did. Total inversion of expectations relative to how people thought that fight was going to go, even if you were favoring one side over the other. I missed a winning night at 317 because of Lima dropping that as a favorite to Talbot. So kudos to anybody that got him as a favorite there. What's crazy is the pre-Barcelos hype on this guy, even going into this spot, doesn't seem to have rebounded as well. Cejudo is 16-5 and now has not won a fight since beating Dominic Cruz for the bantamweight title all the way back in May of 2020. He lost a split decision to Aljamain Sterling after unretiring and coming back from a 3-year layoff in 2023. Won the first round against Merab last year at UFC 298, but lost a unanimous decision over the last 10 minutes. I played the over 2.5 rounds in that one, made it a leg, and it was part of my sweep at that event. And then fought Song Yadong at UFC Seattle in the main event earlier this year. Yadong was pretty comfortably winning that fight. Cejudo might have thought he was up on the scorecards in round 3 and got poked in the eye, I believe between rounds, communicated that he couldn't really see out of the eye, and so kind of forced a technical decision that he ended up losing. So might have been a miscalculation there. Maybe he was having more problems than let on. It's an interesting discussion point given everything that's gone on with Aspinall of late, but I felt very good about Song in that spot as a 2-1 favorite, and he was never really in any danger of losing that one. I don't have a lot to say about this one because Cejudo has already communicated this is his last fight. This is a retirement fight. He's largely moved on doing other stuff. mainly in the content creation space. And he's getting an opponent here that the UFC is clearly trying to prop up as a future contender at bantamweight. This is one of the rare matchups where you have super significant advantages, half-foot advantages in both height and reach within the same weight class. Talbot is 6 inches taller than Cejudo, who, if there was a men's atomweight division, probably could have competed there earlier in his career. Certainly is a more reliable flyweight than I think he is at bantamweight, and is also giving up a 6-inch reach advantage in addition to a more than decade-wide age gap at 38 years old. An earlier version of Cejudo, I think, could potentially give a lot of similar problems to Talbot to what he experienced against Barcelos earlier this year. But given we already saw Talbot correct the issues that he had against Barcelos in terms of getting controlled in that fight, and ended up making it one of the strengths and the primary reasons that he beat Lima, who's a good fighter in his own right. Previously at bantamweight, I believe Lima has now moved up to featherweight. This feels like one-way traffic. And frankly, I can't believe that the market hasn't gone all the way back in on Talbot the way that they were before the Barcelos fight. I don't know how anybody can be betting Cejudo with any optimism here. I could see Talbot winning a comfortable decision. I think what's probably more likely is he's going to set up a second round knockout, similar to what he was doing early in his career, where he would kind of build up a little bit and then get something off really, really vicious. These are just two guys at completely different career trajectories at this point, and it's clear that the UFC wants to push one where they were probably a little bit less than thrilled with Cejudo that he retired at the time that he did, being double champ, where they could have gotten a lot more marketability out of him. Cejudo, I think one of the most miscalculated retirement decisions in UFC history. Missed out on a lot of money and probably a lot more wins. You'll never be able to take double champ status away from him, but he's already communicated this is his last fight, and I think it's probably going to play out as much. I don't see the Robbie Lawler style ending here for Cejudo. I think that this is going to be a pretty comfortable one for Talbot, regardless of how it plays out. But I'm going to say Talbot gets a second round knockout. So Peyton Talbot, round 2 KO. It's going to be hard for me to avoid making this one a parlay leg, just given not only what the numbers are saying and the long-term trends around the advantages Talbot has, but also what Cejudo's already communicated about his retirement. This one feels like as firm a passing of the torch fight as we've had this year, and I think Talbot's going to run with it. The featured fight, bout, whatever you want to call it, at UFC 323 is Tatsuro Taira and Brandon Moreno. Taira enters 17-1, got a bounce-back win in a main event over Hyun-Sun Park that came together on very short notice. After, I'm forgetting who Taira was supposed to. I think it might have been Albazi, but it had to be a short notice fill-in, and Taira looked very dominant, but the win hasn't necessarily aged well, just because Park, as a favorite against Brunno Silva, ended up getting finished in his follow-up performance. So prior to that, we haven't seen Taira since he blew my sweep and what would have been one of the best nights I've had last year against Brandon Royval, losing a split decision that most people felt like Royval won 48-47, and I would tend to agree with. But it was 2-2 going into the fifth. I've mentioned it before, but there's so many people that like to say that Royval dominated and gave him a vet lesson, and that just wasn't the case. It was a very close fight. Taira was even looking like he was in a good spot to win in round 5, but Royval ultimately got great corner advice from, I think it was Alexander Hernandez, and pushed himself back off of the fence while he was on bottom to get a reversal on Taira, and was able to take the 5th round as a result and get the win there. Conversely, Brandon Moreno has had, I don't want to call it a career resurgence because it was back-to-back split decision losses, but the Royval fight was close. The Pantoja fight, I felt like Pantoja won that one pretty. I thought you could have scored it either way, honestly, but I was still a little bit surprised that Pantoja didn't get the unanimous decision win in that one. But still, two fights that could have still been scored in favor of Moreno. Did get a very nice bounce back win against Albazi, and then followed it up with an Urseg win. I was very, very confident in picking him in both of those circumstances, and he looked very good in both of those fights. This is the hardest one for me to call on the entire card, because I see how it's very easy for me to see how one fighter gets the best of the other. It's just a matter of who's going to be able to implement their game plan better. You would think that would favor the underdog here in Moreno, who has more experience. But the tricky thing about this one that I wonder how many people are really considering is this is going to be the first 3-round fight for Brandon Moreno in 5 years. It wasn't since his injury TKO win over Brandon Royval at UFC 255, so nearly 70 pay-per-views ago, that Moreno rather was preparing for a 3-round fight and didn't have 5 rounds with which to game plan. I feel like if this was a 5-round fight, which some people would argue it should be, and frankly, I kind of wish that it was, especially because it's at flyweight, I think that you probably feel a lot better about Moreno here in terms of getting 3 rounds out of 5, particularly with Taira losing a bit of steam in terms of his ability to lean on control and secure dominant positions with what happened against Royval. But Taira, again, just 20, he's still 25, coming in as the younger fighter. Moreno's in his prime, so I'm not necessarily super worried about the age gap here. The thing that more concerns me is we've seen the concession of Moreno's back be a reason that he's lost high-level fights previously, and that was one of the main, even though I don't believe he's ever been submitted. I don't think he's ever been finished. I don't think either of these guys have ever been finished, actually, but it was one of the key reasons that he lost his fight to Pantoja that he could have otherwise won. And yeah, Pantoja's one of the best, if not the best back taker in flyweight history, in UFC history. It's why he's the champion fighting in this next fight we're going to talk about. But it's undeniable that Taira is one of the most impressive grapplers in the UFC in his own right. And yeah, there's been a little bit of Taira skating by on margins, as I used to kind of talk down Sadykhov earlier on this card, but you would still be hard pressed to say that Taira hasn't impressed more than I think Sadykhov has in the similar amount of, I think, UFC. I think Sadykhov has had like 7 UFC appearances. Taira, by my count, has 8. And Taira's got 3 main events in a row now on his resume. And granted, again, in terms of margins, yeah, the Perez fight, and this is why I think Moreno has a very good shot to win this. Taira lost the first round against Perez, but was starting to make good adjustments in the striking, and then was able to take the back, was riding Perez in the backpack. And then the way that he got Perez to the ground, it's not like Perez accidentally got injured. I don't think Taira was intentionally trying to injure him, but the way that he wrenched him to the ground from that backpack position was just so brutal. And it's why, while Perez was trying to stay upright, that he ended up tearing his knee. Taira, he's still trying to figure out a lot of his striking, but the one thing he doesn't get enough credit for is that he's a very dangerous athlete for this weight class. It's why he has not only been such a good grappler, but he's quietly landed, I think he's got 3 knockdowns in his 8 UFC appearances. And he did get knocked down against Kairez. But I think he's had 3 knockdowns in all the other ones, including his most recent appearance against Hyun Sung Park. So this guy's got a little, he hasn't really reached his power hitting years, and you don't typically see a lot of hard hitters at this weight class to begin with. But if Taira does really get his striking ironed out, and he's gotten a little bit incrementally better, still at a very young age, of course. But if he continues to make strides in that department, he's going to be very, very dangerous by the time that he hits his prime, because the power is already starting to show itself a little bit. It's just a matter of matching it with pressure and volume and consistency and tightening up the defense. The defense is largely the bigger concern here. This fight stays standing for 15 minutes. It's Moreno's to win. But Moreno at 64% for his career in terms of takedown defense, right around UFC average, a little bit above, but closer to the average than above average, if you will. Submission upside, I think, is entirely on Taira here. Knockout upside, I think there's more of it for Moreno. Decision upside, Moreno's got a lot more experience, but he's in fights that have gone the distance in his career, he's really fought on very thin margins and gone to splits a lot of the time, and that's something else that I think could end up happening here. It's a very, very tough call, but I'm going to trust that Taira is continuing to make improvements given the age that he's at and how many other fighters have continued to do that in similar spots. Peyton Talbot's another great example of that, as we just talked about in the last breakdown. I'm going to go with Taira here. I don't have a lot of confidence. I won't be surprised either way with the winner, but I'm going to trust that the guy that's coming in at a younger age where he can be making much bigger improvements than I think Moreno can at his stage, even though Moreno's still in his prime. It's just we can continue to see Taira, I think, make more improvements than what we've seen out of Moreno at this stage. Taira's also coming out on 2 times less ring rust. You add in the fact that Moreno has a history of giving up his back to talented grappling specialists like Pantoja. I think that Taira is in a really good spot to win a 29-28 decision here, possibly a split decision. So I'm going to say Taira takes it going the distance. Wouldn't shock me if he ends up getting a submission along the way, becoming the first fighter to submit Brandon Moreno, and think about what that would do for his stock. But Moreno winning by TKO wouldn't necessarily shock me. It would shock me a little bit because Taira's never been finished. Neither of these fighters have ever been finished, but Moreno eking out a decision of his own right on the basis of being the better striker, much as Brandon Royval did a year ago, wouldn't surprise me in the slightest at all either. But I'm going to trust Taira to deliver and get a very close 29-28 decision win that could go either way. The co-main event at UFC 323 is Alexandre Pantoja and Joshua Van. Pantoja enters 30-5, last defended his title at UFC 317 in a co-main event against Kai Kara France. It was actually the first time that it was the first time in a purely professional capacity he's faced Kai Kara France. I believe they fought on The Ultimate Fighter, and Pantoja beat him that time as well. But Pantoja also got a third-round submission in the most recent fight that they had. Pantoja is now on a 8-fight winning streak, which I incorrectly labeled that he was on a 7-fight winning streak on Twitter, I'm now noticing. But in any event, once he gets to 7 or beyond wins, it's basically kind of a wash in terms of the difference between the two. Like, you're dealing with a fighter that's obviously extremely confident given the run that they've been on. But yeah, 8 wins, defended his title twice last year against Kaya Sakura and Steve Erceg. But yeah, beat Brandon Moreno to become the champion at UFC 290 and has only continued to win ever since. Hasn't lost since a close fight with Askar Askarov all the way back in 2020. Conversely, Joshua Van, coming off of one of the fights of the year, arguably the fight of the year, one of the most impressive, arguably the most impressive performance of the year, regardless of what you thought of it being the best fight of the year. TKO'd Bruno Silva in the 3rd round at UFC 316, and then 3 weeks later at the very next pay-per-view, fought the #1 contender in the weight class in Brandon Royval and ultimately got the decision win in unanimous fashion over the number one contender, vaulting himself into a title shot discussion that he has now ultimately received here at just 24 years old. Complete promotional blunder by the UFC not making this the main event. You are given the option between Merab Dvalishvili having a rematch against a fighter that he previously 50-45'd, after Merab has done nothing but dominate the rest of the weight class, basically clean it out, effectively fighting the style of non-fighting where he just, keeps getting mat returns and exhausting his opponent. Alternatively, you have the equivalent of flyweight Max Holloway with the potential to become the youngest UFC champion ever not named John Jones against one of the most impressive and probably undervalued champions in recent memory in Alexandre Pantoja. I wish this fight had happened in Madison Square Garden. It's okay. It's happening on the last pay-per-view of the year, the last pay-per-view ever for the UFC. The fact that this is not a headliner is a complete promotional miscalculation. If Van wins this fight, you are talking about one of the next potential superstars in the UFC, given the age that he's at. And not only the age that he's at, but the fight style with which he deploys. And you're talking about, in addition to that, if he ends up winning this fight, one of the most impressive, there's no way Josh Van is not fighter of the year if he wins. You're talking about one of the most impressive runs in recent memory than any fighter has had. This will be 4 wins for him after, again, getting a win on one pay-per-view and then going on the very next pay-per-view and beating the number one contender on just 3 weeks' notice after fighting a nearly complete fight in his previous installment. My only wish is that we had gotten a 5-round Joshua Van fight prior to him appearing in this spot against Pantoja for the title. At the same time, I think part of the reason the line is the way it is because we haven't seen Van get to shine under 5-round circumstances yet. And I think it's one of the reasons why the line is as wide as it is. Because as experienced as Pantoja is, if there's one criticism you can give him, it's that he recognizes that he doesn't have a 5-round gas tank. And so we have seen in several of his earlier performances, he makes the calculated decision he will strive to win early and then take rounds off so that he will have enough left to come back and win rounds as the fight gets deeper and deeper if he recognizes he's not going to get a finish on his opponent. That was the case against Brandon Moreno. It was the case against Steve Erceg. He knows who he is, and it's why he's such an incredible champion and one that I have enjoyed betting on as a favorite under several circumstances during his title run. But Van is a really, really tough stylistic matchup for him. And a guy that at again, the theme of this card, particularly this main card, has been young fighters that have the potential and have already shown the ability to make dramatic improvements between fights given the age that they're at in their mid-20s. I already invoked it with Peyton Talbot. I already invoked it with Tetsuro Taira. I think I invoked it even earlier on the card with somebody else whose name is eluding me at the moment. I believe it was Farés Ziam, even though he's closer to his late 20s at this point. But Maycee Barber is another good example, given that she's only 27. But again, and Myron Santos is who I was thinking of. It was only 25 and training out of Extreme Couture. So it's a well-established trend that you've seen with all of those names I just mentioned, given the stages that they were in their career. I know some were mid-20s versus late 20s, but still, you don't think Ziam has improved dramatically from the time he was earlier in his UFC career to now? And the same thing with Barber, given that she's only 27, even though we haven't seen her for a year and a half. It's part of the reason there was so much enthusiasm around Barber was the youth upside with how much better she could continue to get. It was a little surprising she left Team Alpha Male in that respect, but we're already past that fight. I do kind of wish that Van would go to a better camp than 4 Ounce Fight Club, but the guy, for someone who presumably needed to improve their takedown defense in the infancy of their UFC run, is now sitting at 81% for his entire UFC career to this point. The guy's got solid takedown defense. A lot of people would say that he's already got the best boxing in the flyweight division. Given the relentless pace that he fights at, I don't know how that can be disputed at this point. The big problem for Van is that he's been so willing to take the first round off in the earlier parts of his UFC run. That wasn't the case against Bruno Silva. That wasn't the case against Brandon Royval. You wondered how that was going to affect him in other third round fights. But even if he does opt to go back to the old Van way of, and again, I hate using the cliches, but the downloading the data style, the same thing that people like to say about the underdog fighting in the main event and Petr Yan. Even if he ends up going back to the old Josh Van in terms of taking that first round off and letting Pantoja bank that first round, and Pantoja likes to do, the guy's going to have 4 more rounds to work with. And he's going to be fighting at a pace that Pantoja, frankly, is just not going to be able to replicate on the feet. The question is going to be, is Pantoja going to be able to effectively take the back and get this fight to the ground where he'll be best suited to have his success? Even if he does, I don't know if he's going to have the cardio to support doing that for 25 minutes if this does go the distance. I think Van is going to give him enough resistance in that area. I see Van giving more resistance to Pantoja in the grappling and wrestling exchanges than I do Pantoja in the striking exchanges. Even though I could see him, Pantoja hits very hard. I could see him potentially, stinging Van or giving him some pause earlier in the fight. But one thing Van really loves to do with all of that volume is the guy, not only does he do such a good job with his pressure, but mixing up his targets. The amount of work that he does to the body in this fight against a fighter like Pantoja that needs to take rounds off to win 5-round fights is going to pay so many dividends for him if this fight gets to round 3, gets to round 4, gets to round 5, and Pantoja hasn't gotten that early decision. It's going to really, really start to wear on Pantoja the later this goes, and Van is just not going to stop if this fight is still standing. The guy is Terminator-like efficiency at this stage of his career. It is kind of a lazy comparison to say that he's flyweight Max Holloway, but the parallels are undeniable. And we haven't even seen this guy unleashed in a 5-round setting yet, which is really where Holloway started to thoroughly dominate so many of his competition. I think this is great value on Josh Van. I think that Pantoja is going to struggle to match the volume of the guy on the feet. I think we're going to get one of the best fights of the year again, as we just did in Van's previous fight. And people forget, his fight with Kyrez at the end of last year was one of the best fights of last year too, frankly. It was brilliant. Both guys ended up hurting each other. But the strides that Van has made at this stage of his career and improving in where he obviously needed to show resistance in order to put fights on his terms, and the weaknesses that Pantoja has had, this is a tricky matchup. This should at least be a closer line. And given that Pantoja is now 35 years old, which is where the decline stage starts to take place on a large, sample, even in again, that's inconsiderate of a lot of MMA fighters that haven't reached the heights that Pantoja has. But at the same time, people also tend to think that flyweight is a division that favors younger fighters as opposed to ones that are getting up there in age, which Pantoja's starting to get there at this point, as brilliant of a champion as he's been. You really have to like the age gap here for Van, and the difference in volume is just impossible to ignore for me on the feet. Pantoja's not going to match it. The only way he's going to equal the damage is by landing bigger shots, which he very well could do. But Van's defense, for how freakish of a pace he fights at, is so impressive. We're going to get a war. We're going to get a fight that is fitting of being a main event, as I alluded to off the top. And I think at the end of it, Josh Van is going to be the youngest champion in UFC history, not named John Jones. I think Van is going to get a 48-47 decision where it is 1-1 going into the third. Pantoja has saved up enough that he wins round 3, but Van continues to make adjustments. The work to the body starts to take its toll on Pantoja. The takedowns don't come as easily. There's more resistance from Van towards Pantoja down the stretch towards what Pantoja wants to do. And Van just takes over the last 2 rounds. And I think Van is going to get a 48-47 decision. And I'll even say that the 5th round of this fight might end up being one of the best rounds that we ever see in a championship fight. Because if it is 2-2 and Pantoja recognizes he's got to leave it all out there in order to defend his belt, it's unquestionable that this guy has the heart of a champion and he's just going to leave it all out there. But I think Van is just going to have more left given the stage that he's at in his career and the style and the amount of body work he's going to do in this one. I love Van as an underdog here. I think the UFC going into next year is going to have one of its biggest stars in years with a belt on, which is something I've talked about on the show you have to do in terms of legitimizing your stars among casual fans. Got to get it done here. Give me Josh Van to win a 48-47 decision in one of the best fights of the year, one of the best title fights that we'll have seen in a while. And I hope they make an immediate rematch. It would be great to run this back at maybe International Fight Week, because Pantoja will certainly deserve it. But I think right now, Josh Van has proven that he's willing to rise to the moment based on what just happened against Royval. And I'm going to say that he does it again. Josh Van and new. And now we come to the main event. Merab Dvalishvili and Petr Yan 2. Dvalishvili enters, bear with me here a moment, 21-4, last fought 9 weeks ago. So not even 3 full months ago at UFC 320 in the co-main event against Corey Sandhagen, a fight in which he won a comfortable 49-46, potentially 49-45 decision. I would agree with giving him a 10-8 in the round 2 of that fight against Corey Sandhagen because he did almost finish it there. And at that point, watching that second round, I was like, oh my gosh, if Merab is consistently finishing his fights now, how much of a monster has he become? But the old Merab kind of came out in terms of, just willing to coast on the non-fight style and just neutralizing his opponent, but still dominating them, which is exactly what he did to Petr Yan the first time that they fought. Jan has since bounced back from that result pretty well on a 3-fight winning streak, now 19-5. Beat Marcus McGee in what he largely considered to be a tune-up fight at UFC Fight Night Whitaker versus DeRitter. It was interesting for Jan in that case because that was a 3-round. I think it was the co-main event at that card. It was at least on the main card, obviously, because it's Jan. But he did do the typical Jan thing of taking the first round off, as I alluded to with Josh Van in the last breakdown, and then totally just overwhelming him down the stretch of the last 10 minutes, which is exactly what I said was going to be the case in the pick that I put out for him, even though I don't think Jan was he was a big favorite in that one. I'm forgetting how big of a favorite he was. He did close -415. I think he might have been a little cheaper than that, but I thought it was, even though some people would say he didn't fight to price maybe necessarily, I still felt pretty certain in the result in terms of how it was going to go, and it went exactly as I thought it would. Dominated Davison Figueiredo in a 5-round main event a little over a year ago at UFC Fight Night. I think that was Macau. And then beat Song Yadong in Miami at UFC 299 in a 3-round unanimous decision win, bouncing back from the dismantling he had against Merab. Okay, so this is going to be the shortest breakdown I've ever given about a main event because it's a joke that this fight is a main event in any capacity. It's a complete disgrace, frankly. I absolutely do not understand why that this is the main event, as I talked about in the last one. Yeah, I just don't get it at all, frankly. And the worst part is, in addition to Merab being a minus 400 favorite because of what happened in the first fight, we're back to ridiculously juiced overs on Merab fights in that this one is now like it's priced even worse than what Merab is. I think at minus 420. I think it might have come down at Merab's priced at like minus 420, 400 range, but the over is basically in the same spot. The first time these two fought, the over 4.5 rounds was minus 220. I played that, cashed, and it's a similar thing with when Vettori fought Dolidze. It was tough for me to see which way it was going to go because I had rough circumstances fading Dolidze of late. I wasn't sure if Marvin was going to get it done, so I hedged on the over because that had been a much more certain outcome with the way that Vettori fights. That hit when they rematched earlier this year. I had gotten burned playing the Vettori money line previously. I had cashed on an over between the two of the fighters before. I thought, why would anything different happen in this case, even though this is a 5-round fight versus a 3-round fight? And that ended up going the distance again. Jan's never been finished. Dvalishvili is a decision machine. He was able to finish O'Malley largely because O'Malley kind of quit, frankly, once he realized he was just going to get rinsed. But I don't see Yan showing that same kind of lack of resiliency because this is a fighter that has never been finished and is going to be eager to get one back on Dvalishvili. And I'll say this too. When I was watching that fight the first time, there was a moment in the first round where I thought Yan might have like tweaked his knee, and that was what led to Dvalishvili getting all of the mat returns and setting the record for takedown attempts in a 5-round fight. Upon rewatch, I didn't see that as clearly, but I still remember having that moment in my head of thinking, did I just see Yan get hurt there, and how is that going to affect the outcome of this fight that he had been favored in? I have heard from people this week that Yan apparently said that he went into that fight with Merab injured. I don't know how true that is, but given what I just said about what I remember about that fight, it certainly wouldn't shock me. And in consideration of that possibility, given how much respect Yan has earned in pretty much every other fight he's been in, I do think that this line is frankly extremely disrespectful. I could see Yan winning a decision here. Like fighting a very, very close fight with Merab, similar to the one that Umar had, where Merab isn't able to get it going after the second round, actually has to get it going in the third round, and it's 2-2 going into the fifth, and who has more left. If Jan's still fresh after 5, if he doesn't start slow because he knows Merab can kind of take a round to get going, as he did against Henry Cejudo a couple years ago, or last year rather, almost 2 years ago at this point. I think this fight is going to play out much more closely than people expect, at least more closely than the first fight did. But it's hard for me to pick against Merab given the fight style and what the guy has accomplished. I know that the over is the much safer bet as it applies to Merab, even if I've gotten burned on it before. There's just no value on it. I wish this had been the co-main because it would have been an easy stay away for me, as I stayed away from Merab's fight against Sandhagen because I thought Merab was a little bit overvalued there too. That being said, in the spirit of doing this, I always put out a pick for the main event. And so I am begrudgingly putting out a pick here. because I have to make a call. And even though there's not really a lot of value on it, I just don't. I think that this is the safer route than picking Merab to win outright, because I think this is going to be a closer fight than people expect. So, yeah, I'm going to say that Merab wins a 48-47 decision. I expect Yan to fight a great fight. I expect for this to be more competitive than people are expecting, but I think Merab puts a stamp on what's been a great year for him as a champion. And yeah, I'll be curious to see if, given what he's alluded to this week about it's been hard for him to make it to 135, if he potentially invites the prospect of moving up to 145 in the future. I don't know how well that'll go for him, because even though the cardio won't be an issue with him moving up in weight, you just wonder how he's going to deal with harder hitters up at featherweight, given the brief glimpses of vulnerability we've seen in his chin previously, and the fact that he is on the cusp of hitting that 35-year-old threshold and will next year. But I think he still probably holds on to his belt here. But it won't terribly shock me if Yan is able to pull off one of the biggest upsets in a title fight this year. What might end up being the biggest title fight in an upset in a title fight this year if he wins. But I feel pretty good about the fight going the distance. It's just a matter of, to me, who's going to end up winning that 5th round, but perhaps even more importantly, who's going to end up winning the 1st round, given both guys can take a little bit to get going. And I think it would serve Yan to try to start this fight fast to get that 1st round banked, and then worry about banking one of the next 3 so that he's in a position going into round 5 where, even if Merab isn't getting tired, you still only need one big moment of damage to take that 5th round away. Which is something Sean O'Malley did after getting close to dominated the first time that they fought, and was still able to steal the 5th round with a kick to the liver, I believe, that, or at least some kind of liver shot that clearly got Merab's attention down the stretch of round 5. In any event, fight over 4.5 rounds, not great value on it. Don't see me putting it in a parlay unless I'm in very dire circumstances. But yeah, if you're going to put a gun to my head and make me make a pick on this fight, I'll say it goes over, but I would much rather bet the over in the 400 range than I would bet on Merab in the 400 range, because I think Yan is going to fight much better to price than Merab does at the price that he's at. So, and still for Merab, but I think it'll be closer than people are expecting. But this fight still doesn't deserve to be the main event. Wow, that's going to do it for the MMA RAXPOD. Thank you very much for tuning in. Again, please like and share the video, as well as on YouTube, as well as on X, Twitter, and subscribe to the YouTube channel if you haven't already, and follow me on X if you haven't already. We are coming to the end of the year here. We're going to have one more card after this, and then we've got a very nice 6-week break before we get to UFC 324 next year, so that'll be great. But yeah, I'm going to have plenty to be preoccupied with in the meantime with my other obligations. And I am going to be making moves to try to get back to Miami in short order. So possibly even back to the old apartment. Maybe not the old apartment, but at least the building I was in before, with a similar view to what was heavily featured in the RAXPOD beta, at least short term. And then we'll see if I'm able to stick around South Florida long term, given everything else going on. But yeah, things are trending in the right direction. Feels great to be back in doing, working in sports betting full time again. And yeah, I appreciate the support of all of you for continuing to tune in and stick around. It really means a lot. So thank you very much. I'll have picks out for the last fight night of the year, Royval Cop, I believe it is. But yeah, up until then, I will talk to you in 2026, and looking forward to all of the or they're not pay-per-views anymore, all of the numbered events and fight nights and great UFC events to come in the future with Paramount and beyond. So stick around for then. Until then, enjoy the rest of this year, and Happy New Year and happy holidays to you and all your families. Take care, folks. Good luck this weekend.